There are places in this world that time has forgotten, where prayers are not spoken but chanted into the void, where silence is not peace but a warning. Welcome to Whispers of Asia, a channel where the dead do not rest and the living do not speak too loudly. Here we do not tell stories. We pass on the hauntings that survive in breathless voices, faded murals, and cursed earth. Each tale you hear was whispered once, in back alleys, in mountain villages, by the light of an oil lamp. Folklore not meant for the ears of strangers. But tonight, we invite you to listen anyway. If you feel something behind you, don't look, just breathe, just listen. Because tonight, we begin a story few dare remember. A story of a monk who chants not to praise the divine, but to keep the dead from waking. The first sound was a bell. Not loud, not urgent, but clear, like a soft metallic whisper drifting through the misty ridges above Chiang Rai. It rang 3 times. No wind stirred, no birds called back. The night was still, too still, and the villagers who heard it from below paused. Some held their breath, some bowed without knowing why, and some turned their heads away, choosing not to speak of what they'd heard. Because they all knew where the sound came from. It came from Wat Kiri Luong, the temple that no one visited anymore. A temple that rang its own bell. Long ago, monks once lived there, young, devoted, golden-robed shadows against the mountain stone. But now the place had only one monk, an old man with hollow eyes, skin like dried bark, and a voice that never stopped chanting. He had chanted for over 30 years. Pra Viroj. That was his name, though no one had spoken it aloud in years. They said he no longer ate, no longer walked. He simply knelt in the main hall, murmuring the same chant over and over, through day and night, through storm and sun, through sickness and solitude. Why? The elders would only answer with silence or a trembling whispered phrase. He chants so we can sleep. It was Niran, a young school teacher from the nearby village of Ban Hor Doi, who first took interest. He'd grown up hearing stories of the temple, of the monk who spoke to no one, of the chant that bound the mountain. His mother had once warned him as a boy, "If you hear the bell, stay inside. It's not for the living." But that night, he hadn't stayed inside. He'd opened his window and looked up at the mountain where the clouds curled like fingers around the hilltop. And he saw something. A flicker, a shape, a figure cloaked in saffron walking toward the temple's edge, lit from behind by firelight. And then he heard the chant. Not loud, not human, a raspy, bone-dry murmur that vibrated inside his skull more than his ears. A language he didn't know, a rhythm too slow for prayer and too steady for song. It made his heart beat differently. And then, silence. The next morning, Niran couldn't stop thinking about it. The bell, the chant, the monk. He wasn't the only one. 2 days later, a group of outsiders, Thai and foreign, arrived in the village. A documentary crew, camera gear in tow, seeking permission to film rural temples for a new spiritual travel series. They introduced themselves politely, smiled often, said they were from Bangkok, working with a streaming platform. One of them, a woman named Pim, seemed unusually serious. She didn't speak much, only observed. When they mentioned Wat Kiri Luong, the village velder, Ajahn Surasak, grew still. Why that place? Because no one goes there, the producer replied with a grin. And that's the story, isn't it? Ajahn Surasak didn't smile back. The story is why you shouldn't go. But they went anyway, with backpacks and cameras and voice recorders and drone batteries, with intentions pure and proudly foolish. Niran, against his better judgment, agreed to guide them halfway up the trail, not because he wanted to, but because something inside him, some quiet ache of unfinished curiosity, needed to see the temple again. They left just before sunset. The trail was long and coiled like a serpent around the mountain. Trees pressed in from both sides. The air grew cold even before darkness fully came, and not a single bird chirped after the first bend. "It's like the forest knows we're not welcome," Pim whispered. Niran didn't respond. He was too focused on the silence ahead and on the sound behind it. A faint rhythm. A chant. They reached the halfway mark and Niran stopped. "I won't go further," he said, avoiding their eyes. "Why?" asked the director. "Because I'd like to sleep tonight." There was something final in his voice, so they thanked him, laughed politely, and kept going. He waited at the halfway rest hut, an old wooden bench under a rusted tin roof, and watched the crew vanish into the mist above. And then he waited longer. And then he heard the bell. It was fainter this time, one soft ring, then two, then silence. No wind, no echo, just that metal sound sliding through the fog like a knife. He turned away and began to descend. By the time the crew reached the temple gate, night had fully swallowed the sky. The stone pillars loomed like teeth. The rusted bell above the entrance swayed gently, though the air was still. Their lights flickered once, and then the chanting grew louder. The main hall stood open. No doors, no locks, just darkness beyond the threshold. And inside it, Pra Viranch, kneeling, facing an ancient altar, eyes closed, mouth moving in slow, endless rhythm. The chant was not melodic. It was not peaceful. It scraped against the mind like rust on glass. Pim held up her mic. This isn't normal chanting." "What language is this?" one of the crew asked. "It's not Pali. It's something older." They began to film. The camera lens captured the crumbling murals along the inner walls, faded images of monks in red robes, each holding strange objects, skulls, blades, ropes. One mural was scratched out completely. Only a figure in white remained, its face obscured. A gust of wind slammed the doors shut behind them, though there had been no doors a moment ago. Their crew froze. Praviroj didn't stop chanting. In the days that followed, only one member of the crew would return to the village. Her name was Pim, and she came down the mountain alone, shoeless, bleeding from the soles of her feet, eyes wide and unfocused, carrying nothing but a single roll of film. She spoke only once, in a whisper. "He chants so they won't walk, but the chant is fading." That night, the bell rang again, twice. No wind, no hands, just sound. Down in the village, Niran woke to find a folded saffron robe laid neatly across his doorstep. On top of it, a scrap of parchment. old, smudged with ash, and on it, written in a hand not touched by time, "If he stops, they will not forget." They found the monk exactly where he had always been, kneeling in front of a crumbling altar, his back turned to them, body motionless, except for his lips. The crew had entered the temple just past midnight, flashlights flickering, cameras rolling, equipment humming like insects in the dark. The hall was vast but empty. The floor creaked beneath them, yet made no sound, as if the wood had long forgotten how to echo. Even their footsteps seemed absorbed by the silence. Only the monk's voice carried. "Is he even alive?" whispered Santi, the sound tech, as he adjusted his mic. "Don't touch him," Pim replied, too quickly. She stared at the monk's spine, hunched, sharp, unmoving, and felt something she couldn't name, a pull, like gravity had turned spiritual and was now dragging her mind inward. "We should record the chant," the director said. "At least for ambient audio, it's gold." "It doesn't feel like gold," Santi muttered. The recording began. Pim pressed the mic forward gently, keeping her distance. The words the monk spoke were unfamiliar, harsh, rhythmic, and slow. Not Pali, not Sanskrit, not any dialect she'd heard in her years studying Thai liturgy. They sounded wrong, not just old, off, like a prayer said backward or a lullaby meant to keep something awake. They explored the rest of the temple over the next hour. 3 buildings, 1 bell tower, an empty sleeping hall lined with dust-covered mats, each one with a single folded robe at its center. 12 robes, all untouched for decades. No shoes, no bowls, no names. Just the strange sense that the monks had once been here, and then vanished. One crew member, Dao, found a set of sandals turned toward the edge of a stone balcony, as if someone had stepped out of them before walking into the sky. "Why are all the shoes left behind?" she asked. No one answered. The mural wall caught their attention next. The main hall was surrounded by it, a sweeping panorama that told a story with faded pigments and eerie clarity. It showed monks in a ritual circle, an altar in the center, stars above their heads, and around them, figures drawn in a different style, thinner, shadow-like, faces blank. Not spirits, not humans, something in between. The final part of the mural had been clawed away, not chipped, not worn, clawed. The stone beneath was gouged deeply, like something angry had tried to erase itself. Back outside, the bell tower loomed. Santi offered to fly the drone for a sweeping shot of the bell, but the winds had picked up sharply, despite the air remaining still. The drone lifted 3 meters, then dropped like a rock. No wind, no technical error, just failure. When he retrieved it, he found the blades warped, melted inward like candle plastic. The footage was static, but in one frame, they saw something they couldn't explain. A shape next to the monk. Too tall, too thin, too wrong. Pim paused the video. The figure had no face. "We're not supposed to be here," Pim whispered. But the director was already making plans. "This is perfect," he said. "We don't need to fake anything. This is real. We document the monk, the mural, the bell, the legend, all of it." Pim stared at him, her voice low. "There's no legend. There's something worse than legend." That night, they set up base in the storage hall behind the temple. Cots laid out,
power banks charging, laptops ready, cameras backed up. But something was wrong. They reviewed footage from the previous night, the approach to the temple, the monk chanting, the bell ringing, and yet, in every clip, the audio had a faint distortion beneath it. A second voice. Not the monk. Something whispering with him. When they ran the track through a spectral analyzer, Pim gasped. The wave pattern was a mirror of the monk's chant, as if something were repeating every word but backward. "That's not feedback," Dao said. "No," Pim said. "That's a conversation." They tried to sleep, but one by one, each of them woke through the night, not from nightmares, but from dreams too quiet to remember, but too loud to forget. A strange humming in the walls, the soft sound of sandals dragging across stone, and then the bell. Ringing again, 4 times. This time, Pim got up and walked outside. The night was black, no moon. The clouds hung low and suffocating. The temple bell above the gate swayed. Below it stood the monk, not kneeling, not chanting, just standing motionless, his face tilted toward the sky, and on his cheek a tear of blood. When Pim called out to him, he vanished. At dawn, the air turned heavy and wet, as if the mountain had started to sweat grief. The crew ate quietly, no jokes, no energy, each of them burdened by something they couldn't name. Then Pim pulled out an old book from her bag, an obscure collection of forbidden Thai funeral rites, a gift from her university mentor. She flipped to a handwritten note tucked in the middle. It was an ink sketch, 12 monks, 1 altar, a chant, and beside it, written in red, Pratama Sat, the chain of death, used only once for the forsaken, never completed. Those who begin the chant must never stop, or the dead will remember the way back. She read the passage aloud. Her voice trembled. In the old days, they say you could trap a restless spirit, not with fire, but with sound. Tie it with the living tongue. Chant its name backward. Bury it beneath rhythm. But the ritual is like a cage built of smoke. It works only as long as the chant is never broken. And if it breaks? Dao asked. Pim looked at her, hollow. Then what you bound will wake, and it will not forget what it was. Later that day, one of the crew, a young man named Ken, wandered too close to the edge of the hill behind the temple. He said he heard his mother's voice. They found him sitting cross-legged in the forest, whispering to the air. When they asked who he was speaking to, he only smiled and replied, "She says I have to choose soon, because his voice is getting weak." That night, the monk chanted louder, not urgently, but with strain, as if pushing back something that was pressing against him. It echoed through the whole mountain. The stars above the temple seemed to fade. The crew didn't sleep. They watched. And the longer they listened, the more they understood. He doesn't chant alone. He never has. The dawn brought no warmth. Mist clung to the temple grounds like old breath, thick and low, curling around the stone steps and faded prayer flags. The crew rose from their thin sleep, not because they were rested, but because sleep had become unsafe. Each of them had dreamed of being watched. Not followed, watched, and always by something just outside the frame. Tao refused to speak. Ken kept humming under his breath, a tune that sounded eerily close to the monk's chant. Pim sat apart, clutching the ancient notebook she'd brought, the one that mentioned the Pratamasat. That morning, she flipped to the page again. The ink had blurred slightly, perhaps from her sweat, or perhaps from something less explainable. Still, the red writing remained. Those who begin the chant must never stop, or the dead will remember the way back. She had heard of such things, not in textbooks, but in whispers between professors, shared over candles during drunken academic retreats. Rituals outlawed by the monastic councils, remnants of older, darker belief systems where Buddhism collided with raw animism. Chants not meant for enlightenment, but for containment. Pim stepped outside. The main prayer hall was bathed in a watery light, the monk still kneeling where he had always been. But something had changed. His chant was faster, only slightly, but noticeably, like a man trying to keep pace with something approaching. She entered quietly, camera in hand, and filmed him for 15 minutes, then paused the recording and stepped closer. Pra Ajan, she whispered, the respectful title for a senior monk. No response. Kun Pra, can you hear me? His lips kept moving, but his hands were trembling now, barely, but enough. Then, as if an answer, the temple bell above the gate rattled once, without wind, without movement. Pim turned, and in that flicker of time, in the reflection of the polished altar, she saw it. A second figure behind her. Not human, not shaped for prayer. She fled the room. Back in the storage hall, Pim shared what she'd seen with the director, whose enthusiasm had begun to fray around the edges. We're not hallucinating, she said. There's something occupying this place, something that needs the chant to stay quiet. The director, now pale and sleep-starved, glanced at the others. Let's finish filming and leave. We have enough for an entire series. We'll just frame it as a mystery. No conclusions, just questions. That's the problem, Pim said. There is a conclusion. We're standing in it. Later that day, Ken disappeared. He had wandered off after lunch, muttering about a second bell in the woods. They found his camera beside the outer shrine, still recording. Playback showed Ken walking alone, following something unseen. Then suddenly, he stopped, turned slowly to face the lens, and whispered, "He's tired. You can hear it now. His voice is thinning." And then he walked out of frame. When they followed the trail, they found a ring of sandals laid in a perfect circle. Ken's were in the center, and on them, smeared in what looked like ash, was a symbol, the Thai character for return. That night, the monk's chant became erratic, not weaker, but more desperate. Sometimes his voice cracked. Sometimes it changed pitch mid-word. It sounded like two people were chanting at once, but badly synced, like the voices were fighting for control. Pim sat on the floor just outside the main hall, listening, not daring to step inside. And that's when the novice appeared. A boy, maybe 15, wearing faded robes, standing in the corner where shadows pooled unnaturally deep. She blinked, thinking it was a trick of the candlelight. But the boy spoke first. "They made him do it," he said. We all agreed, but only he stayed. Pim's throat dried instantly. Who are you?" The boy stepped forward. His skin was gray, his eyes dark but full of grief. "I was called Boon Mi. We were 12 novices. We found the chant buried in a Khmer scroll sealed behind the altar. It said it could stop the sickness, protect the village from the rot. But the dead we called were not ours." He raised one hand and pointed toward the mural wall. "The ritual must never stop. And now he's dying. The weight is too much. One of you must take it." Pim stood. "Wait, what?" But the boy was already gone. No footsteps, no sound, just absence. She ran to the mural wall. What had once been a faint outline now showed a new figure, a face that looked strangely like Ken's. The mural was changing, and Pra Viroch was beginning to bleed from the eyes. The crew tried to leave the next morning. They packed in silence, broken only by the chant echoing from the hall. But when they reached the path back down the mountain, it wasn't there. The trees had grown closer. The trail was gone, swallowed by thick roots and new growth that had not been there the day before. Dao tried to force her way through and collapsed moments later, gasping for air. "It's like the forest is folding," she whispered. "It won't let us leave until he dies, or until someone else takes the voice." That night they gathered outside the main hall, too afraid to enter. Inside, the monk chanted, now coughing between stanzas. The bell above the gate rang 5 times, a record. The sky wept ash instead of rain, and Pim, holding the notebook, finally began to translate the chant, syllable by syllable. It spoke of binding, of grief given shape, of 12 mouths chanting to keep the hungry dead in their graves. The final lines were torn from the page, but one phrase was repeated 3 times. "Let the tongue burn, let the soul not sleep, let the mouth never close." Pim began to cry. The truth was too clear now. This chant wasn't just a curse. It was a contract. One voice must always speak. If that voice dies and no one takes its place, they all return. Suddenly, the chanting stopped. The crew froze. The silence was crushing, louder than the chant had ever been. Then the wind screamed through the trees, the bell rang one more time, and the doors to the prayer hall slammed shut on their own. From behind them, a voice, too deep to be Pra Viroch, whispered, "He cannot carry them anymore." When Pim forced the doors open, Pra Viroch lay collapsed at the base of the altar, mouth still moving but without sound. His body shuddered, his throat convulsed, and from his lips came a voice that wasn't his, higher, childlike, mocking. "We kept him quiet for so long, but now he's tired. You'll help, won't you?" And in that moment, the shadows around the altar began to breathe. Dao screamed. Pim dropped to her knees, and from the back wall of the hall, the mural began to bleed. 12 shadows stepped forward. Each held a rope, or a skull, or a broken bowl. They had no faces, but all of them smiled. The silence that followed the monk's collapse was not peace, it was pressure, a pulsing weight in the air, thick enough to choke. Outside the prayer hall, the jungle buzzed as if disturbed. Insects rising in waves, birds suddenly silent, the forest breathing in and not exhaling. Inside, the crew stood frozen. Tao clutched her mouth to keep from screaming. The director, who hadn't spoken since Ken vanished, dropped his flashlight. Pim knelt slowly beside Praviroch. He was alive, but barely. His lips were torn and bleeding, whispering syllables that no longer formed structure. His throat convulsed with dry gasps. The chant was breaking, unraveling like a thread pulled too tight for too long. And in its absence, something else was waking. The back mural had changed again. What had once been 12 hooded monks was now 11. One had vanished completely, its outline faded into the stone. In its place was a smear of red, as if it had bled out of the painting and dissolved. The remaining 11 figures now had no eyes. The sockets where once faint detail had been carved were now gouged, scraped violently by some sharp edge. "They're going blind," Pim whispered. "They were never meant to see what they summoned." Above the altar, the central figure remained, the kneeling monk in gold robes. His face was unchanged, but now blood streaked down from beneath the paint, a thick, fresh stream running from the eyes. Tao backed away. "We're in the painting," she said. "Pim, we're inside the story. We can't leave because it's not finished." That night, they sealed the doors to the prayer hall from the outside. It was all they could do. Praviroch resumed his chant, weak and rasping, but the sound seemed hollow, echoed, as if it no longer reached the things it needed to bind. The director curled into himself beside the storage room wall and mumbled about endings. Tao refused to close her eyes. Pim sat with the notebook again, forcing herself to translate more. The Prathamasat, it seemed, was not simply a chant of containment. It was a contract of sacrifice, one where the original 12 agreed to speak for the dead, but in doing so, bound themselves to eternal vigilance. One monk for each cycle of the moon. When the chant was begun, the monks could not die naturally. They would fade, one by one, unless another voice stepped forward. The final lines, scribbled in red, burned into Pim's mind. The eyes of the living must close. The mouths of the dead must remain open. When the chant stops, the balance collapses. The gate remembers. At 3:33 a.m., the bell rang again. Once. Then again. Then again. 3 chimes. And then a fourth. Pim sat up straight. Each ring matched the number of vanished monks in the mural. First one, then Ken, now another. She ran to the prayer hall. Inside, Praviroch was not alone. A second figure knelt beside him, Tao. Her eyes were open but unseeing. Her lips moved in perfect sync with the monk. Blood dripped from her nose. "Tao," Pim whispered. The girl didn't react. She simply chanted, and her voice was not her own. It was deeper, male, a sound that should never come from her throat. The mural had changed again. Now only 10 monks remained, and beside them a new shadow had been painted in, one that looked too much like Tao. Pim tried to pull her away, but Tao's body had grown stiff, like stone, like wax. Her fingers locked in mudra, her spine rigid, her skin gray. And in that moment, Pim felt something move behind the altar. A whisper, a shuffle. Then the faintest sound of something wet, breathing in the dark. She backed out slowly, and the chant continued. That day, the director was found hanging in the bell tower, not by rope, but by prayer beads. hundreds of them, wound tight around his throat, his feet just dangling above the old bronze bell. No one had heard him climb, no one had seen him go. He'd left one message behind, a single line carved in the wood beside his cot. Eyes gone, can't look away, he's inside the chant now. His name, too, vanished from the mural. Only 9 figures remained, and below them, written in Thai calligraphy, "We are becoming." Pim spent that night digging through the storage room. Old scrolls, cracked manuscripts, broken offering bowls. At the very back of the shelf, wrapped in red cloth, she found a single black and white photograph. It was old, perhaps 50 years, showing 13 monks in a line. Young, smiling, all of them except one, Praviroch, standing at the end, unsmiling, staring directly into the lens. Behind them was the same mural, but complete, all 12 monks shown, eyes intact, and one more thing, a face in the shadows behind them, barely visible, distorted, inhuman, but present, watching, even then. Pim lit incense before the altar that evening, not to pray, not to ask for help, but to warn. We know your name now, but we don't know how to end you. The chant continued. Praviroch's body now shook with effort. His lips bled. His knees had cracked open and left stains on the stone floor. Tao was still beside him, still chanting, still unblinking. The mural bled again, and the shadows behind the painted monks grew deeper. One of them now held a mirror. Pim approached the mural once more, and when she looked at the mirror in the painting, she saw her own face. That night, Pim dreamed of the boy again, Bunmi. But this time he was not alone. The other novices stood behind him, silent, eyeless, holding the tools of the ritual. Bunmi stepped forward and whispered, "The chant was only the lock, but the temple is the box, and you're already inside." When Pim woke, her mouth was bleeding. Her teeth had been grinding the chant in her sleep. She didn't remember it, but her voice was hoarse. The next morning, the bell rang once more. 7 chimes. And the mural, only 7 monks remained.
The morning sky never brightened. It remained the same color as bones soaked in river water, gray, swollen, suffocating. The mist no longer clung to the ground. It crawled, thick as muscle, over stone and root, seeping beneath the doors and resting against the skin like breath that didn't belong to you. And still, the monk chanted. Broken, trembling, blood-wet, but he chanted. And now Pim understood why. She sat beside the prayer hall, notebook in her lap, eyes on the mural that continued to bleed and shift when no one looked directly at it. Only 6 monks remained in the painting now. 6 where there had once been 12. And each face had lost its eyes. But something else had appeared. Behind the line of monks, where once there had only been temple walls, now stood graves. Open ones, half dug, shallow enough for what lay within to listen. Pim didn't know who they were for, but she had a guess, and that guess kept her from sleeping at all. She found another page in the old notebook, one that had previously been blank. Now words had appeared, scrawled, jagged, written in haste. He chants so they sleep. He chants so we do not wake them. He chants because no one else will.
That afternoon, Pim approached the monk again. Praviroj was thinner than before. His body shook with each syllable. His tongue was cracked and swollen, coated in black. His fingers bled from where his nails had curled inward. And yet he still bowed to the altar, still offered up the chant like meat to beasts. "Ajarn," she whispered softly, "you don't have to carry it anymore." He did not open his eyes, but for the first time he spoke words that weren't part of the chant. "They do not sleep on their own. They must be sung to, like infants in the dark." His voice was hoarse, but his next words were louder, a rasp, a command. "I chant so they sleep. I sleep so they rise. I die so they return." Pim sank to her knees. "What are they?" He turned his head toward her slowly. "Us." That night, lightning rolled in, but brought no thunder. The storm clouds hung just above the tree line, swollen with silence. And the bell rang 6 times. 6 figures now chanted inside the hall. 6 shadows, 6 voices, but only 2 of them were breathing. Pim heard it in her dreams, a wet, dragging sound, as if something ancient had begun to pull itself through the roots of the mountain. In the dream, she stood in the center of the mural, surrounded by monks with bleeding mouths, their robes fluttering without wind. The central altar stood cracked, with a single lotus bowl turned upside down, inside it, a tongue petrified and black. She awoke, gasping, and her pillow was soaked through, not with sweat, but with river water. The villagers down below had begun to whisper again. Niran heard it in the classroom, students arriving with stories of hearing names in their dreams, names of long-dead relatives, grandmothers, sisters, parents. Some said they heard the chant coming from the mountain. Others claimed they saw shapes walking between trees, slow and tall, with no faces. The village dogs had stopped barking. The birds no longer came. And then came the first death. A woman named Molly, 82 years old, widowed, alone, was found kneeling in front of her spirit house at dawn. Mouth open, tongue missing, eyes rolled back white. In her hand, a single word written in blood on paper: return. Back at the temple, Pim could feel the pressure of the place thickening. Gravity felt uneven, shadows pooled too long, sound echoed before she made it. And the chant had changed. It was faster now, urgent. It had lost its rhythm, replaced by something primal, as if the monk were now pleading. She set up her audio recorder again, but this time the playback carried more than just voice. Between breaths, she heard scraping wood, gurgled moaning, nails on stone, something tapping in threes, and once, just once, a child's laugh. The mural thou showed 5 monks, and behind them the graves had changed. Now they were open. Hands had begun to reach from the soil, elongated, bony, wrong. One of them held a torn string of prayer beads. That evening, Pim found a room behind the main altar. A sealed door, invisible behind a curtain. Inside, only dust and bones. 12 sets of monks' robes, folded neatly. A bowl of dried flowers, rotted black. and a slab of cracked stone carved with ritual words and marked in faded red. At the center, a circle drawn in ash, still untouched after decades. Pim stepped inside, and then every candle in the temple went out at once. From the darkness, she heard breathing, close, not behind her, inside the room. Then a voice, low and deep. He chants, so you forget, so you can live. She ran. Outside, the bell rang 5 times. 5 shadows now chanted in the hall. The mural bled again, and one monk was painted with an open mouth but no jaw. Pim vomited behind the shrine and wept. Then she heard it. From the far edge of the temple grounds, beyond the bamboo grove, a second chant, not human, mocking, reversed, a taunt in rhythm. They're answering now, she whispered. They've learned how to chant back. That night, Viroj collapsed. His body could no longer support the weight of the chant. He fell mid-verse, gasping, eyes wide open. The other shadows paused. Then one, Tao, began to chant alone. Her voice sounded hollow. Her lips moved too fast. It wasn't her anymore. The mural changed again. Now 4 monks remained, and in the background, the temple on fire. Pim stared at the flames in the mural and whispered to herself, "He chants so they sleep, but if he dies, we all wake up."
There were no insects that night. No frogs, no crickets, not even the soft chirp of geckos clinging to stone. The jungle was too quiet, the kind of silence that presses in, that wraps around the ears and chest like damp cotton, the kind of silence that has a reason. And inside Wat Kiri Luang, only one thing made a sound, the chant. Weaker now, slower, struggling. Viroj could no longer sit upright. His spine had curved, his muscles atrophied, his skin thinned to the texture of old leaves. Still, he lay on the stone floor, cheek to altar, whispering through cracked lips. The others, or what was left of them, stood around him. Tao was among them, her body unmoving, eyes half-lidded, mouth muttering syllables that Pim could no longer bear to translate. Each word now felt alive, like the chant itself had become sentient, not a spell, but a tongue, growing inside those who dared repeat it. That morning, Pim opened the notebook one last time. Most of the pages were now blank, not because they had been erased, but because she could no longer read them. The ink seemed to slither when she looked directly at it. Letters moved, twisted, inverted themselves like snakes devouring their own tails. But one line remained steady. It had appeared during the night. "There is something beneath." She returned to the main hall just after sunrise. No mist today, just dry air and a sour smell like fermented incense and something rotting beneath it. The floor felt different. She removed her shoes and walked barefoot, testing the planks. Near the altar, a hollow sound, soft, subtle, but there. She tapped again. Hollow. She knelt and pressed her ear against it. Nothing. Then, a
a faint scrape. From beneath. With trembling hands, she lit a stick of incense and pressed it into the offering bowl. Then she took the old rusted lantern from the shelf and pried at the floorboards. The wood groaned. Dust spilled up like a breath that had waited decades to exhale. And then a narrow opening. A trapdoor concealed beneath a layer of woven mat and dust thick enough to hide it from generations. She opened it. A single wooden staircase led down into blackness. No draft, no smell, just weight, a spiritual heaviness that clung to her spine. She descended. The stairway led into a stone cellar, cold and silent, lit only by the orange glow of her lantern. The walls were carved with patterns, looping, interwoven script that resembled Thai, but older, more primal. In the center of the room was a circle made of bones, arranged with surgical precision, human finger bones, hundreds of them, each pointing inward toward a black stone bowl that sat in the center. Inside the bowl, ash, hair, teeth, a piece of wet cloth that never dried. Behind it, against the wall, stood 12 objects, each neatly arranged. A folded robe, a wooden bowl, a prayer bead strand, and a name written in red wax. 11 of the names were faded. The 12th name was still fresh. Tao. Pim stepped closer. A breeze moved behind her, though there was no wind. She turned. A figure stood at the bottom of the stairs. Ken, or something shaped like him. His face was the same, but his eyes were hollow. His mouth moved slightly, as though whispering, but no sound came out. And then he blinked. It's not just the dead who need sleep. Sometimes it's the grief, and grief doesn't stay buried. He walked past her, sat cross-legged beside the bone circle, and began to chant. His voice was beautiful, eerily calm, filled with sorrow and age. Pim could not move. She stood in that dark chamber, listening to the chant echo off the stone, hearing the walls reply in murmurs. Then she noticed. The shadows were not behaving. They were too thick, too slow, and they leaned inward, toward the circle, toward the voice, like they were listening. She climbed back up. When she reached the top, the trapdoor closed behind her on its own. No wind, no latch, just finality. And above, the bell rang 4 times. Later that evening, the villagers sent word. 3 more people had died. One of them, a 10-year-old girl, had carved the symbol of the chant into her wall with a spoon. She had never visited the temple, never heard the chant, but she knew the words. She had told her mother the night before, "He chants, so we don't have to." She smiled when she said it. The next morning, she was gone. No signs of struggle, only her small sandals neatly placed at the foot of her bed. Pim sat alone near the bell tower that night. The sky above felt bruised, swollen with silence. She knew now the chant was no longer contained within the temple. It was seeping, dripping like oil into the roots of the mountain, sliding into dreams, into minds, into language. It was becoming a memory of the land itself, a spiritual virus, and the only firewall was the monk. But Prawi Roach had not spoken all day. He lay on his side, mouth open, air whistling through his teeth. The chant had stopped hours earlier. Tao was still muttering, but it was incoherent now, the rhythm broken, the power fading. And below the altar, the trap door had begun to vibrate. Something beneath was waking. She tried to rouse the monk. "Please," she whispered, "you have to finish it. Or teach me. I'll carry it. I will. Just don't let it end like this." Prawi Roach opened his eyes. Blood filled the whites. "It's already outside. You can't chant what you don't mourn." She didn't understand. "What do you mean?" "It doesn't obey language. It obeys loss." Then, for the first time, he smiled, but it was a smile of resignation. "You came here to listen. That means it's already chosen you." The bell rang 3 times. The mural showed only 3 monks left, and behind them, the graves were now empty. The ground above them cracked and bleeding, and in the shadows something crawled on hands made of prayer beads and fingers that moved backward. That night, the chant returned, but this time it came from beneath the floor, from below the altar, from within the bones, from the ash. A dozen voices, crying, pleading, calling not for release, but for continuance. And Pim knew the chant would not survive another night.
Pim sat beneath the prayer flags, watching the wind sway cloth that should have long decayed. The fabric was sun-bleached and brittle, but it still fluttered as if it were alive or listening. Everything here listened. The wood, the stone, the roots beneath the temple. And the silence now felt like a throat being cleared before something spoke. The chant had weakened again. Biroj coughed more than he recited. Tao whispered broken syllables like a child humming to keep from crying. And beneath the floor, something answered. The trap door pulsed now, not with breath, not with heat, but with sound, low, humming, a bass note of grief that vibrated up through the walls. Pim could feel it in her bones. She wrote in the notebook with trembling fingers. The chant is not a barrier, it is a leash, and it's fraying. That morning, the final recording from Ken's camera was recovered. It had been left at the base of the bell tower, its battery dead, but the memory card intact. Pim watched it alone. The footage showed Ken walking through the bamboo grove behind the temple. He was chanting, calmly, repetitively, but not the monk's chant, his own. In a childlike voice, he repeated the same phrase in Thai. "Tie it with tongue, let it crawl, but not stand. Let it see, but not remember." Then he reached the old stone well behind the hill, a place no one had spoken of until now, and dropped the camera inside. Pim found the well an hour later. It was covered in moss and vines, hidden behind a crumbling statue of the Buddha with its head broken off. Inside, no water, just darkness and the faintest echo of weeping. She turned back. The bell rang. Twice. The mural in the prayer hall had changed again. Only 2 monks remained. One of them had no hands. The other had no face. Behind them, the temple was depicted as cracked open, with vines wrapping the spire like a noose. The graves were gone. In their place, open mouths.
Dozens, rows of them, screaming wordlessly. That night, Pim confronted Praviroj one last time. He was barely conscious. His lips moved without sound. His fingers tapped the floor in a rhythm that mimicked the chant. Pim knelt beside him and asked softly, "Is there no end to this?" He turned to her, and for the first time, his voice held emotion. "There is only exchange." "For what?" "Peace is paid with memory, and memory must be sung." She didn't understand, so he explained in broken, breathless fragments. Long ago, before the temple, before Buddhism touched the hills, the villagers had no names for grief. They believed the dead stayed nearby, not to haunt, but because no one remembered how to let them go. So they created chants, not prayers, not blessings, bindings. Words carved in breath, recited in rhythm, not to guide souls onward, but to keep them from walking back. Each chant was a chain, and those who chanted became the gatekeepers. Pim whispered, "And what happens when the chain breaks?" The monk smiled without joy. "Then memory returns, and with it, everything we buried." That night, Pim stayed awake beneath the eaves, watching the lantern light flicker. She heard something moving beneath the floor again, scraping, like nymphanides across stone. Then, without warning, Tao stood up. She walked silently to the altar, barefoot, her eyes rolling back as she began to chant, but now in reverse, a mocking echo, a corruption of the original. Pim lunged for her, but was thrown back by a gust of wind that had no source. The candles snuffed out, and from the mural, the final monk disappeared. Now there were none. The bell rang once, a final lonely tone, and the trapdoor beneath the altar exploded upward, flung open by force from the low. From the hole rose a smell that Pim gagged, old blood, wet ash, burned offerings, and then a hand, pale, thin, knotted with rosary beads wrapped around a wrist like veins. Another hand followed, and then a face. Not Tao, not Ken, not anyone. Something older, featureless, its mouth sewn shut, yet twitching. The entity pulled itself out from the dark, robes dragging ash with them, not walking, but gliding as if carried by the grief of others. Pim screamed. She backed into the mural wall, and that's when she realized she was now painted into the mural. A new figure had appeared, her face, her posture, her eyes open wide with horror. And beneath her feet, chains breaking. The monk, barely able to lift his head, began to chant one final time. His voice broke on every syllable, but he kept going. The entity paused, then screamed, not aloud, but inside Pim's head, a sound of rage, betrayal, and hunger. She dropped to her knees, weeping blood from the corners of her eyes, and from her throat, the chant emerged, not by choice, not by effort, but by inheritance. Praviroj smiled one last time. You heard it, and now it's yours. He collapsed, and this time his body did not breathe again. Pim stood before the altar, eyes glazed, mouth moving. The chant had passed to her. The entity hissed. It crawled back into the pit, forced down by the rhythm, and the trapdoor slammed shut. The bell did not ring again that night, but the villagers said. The mountain sighed.
No one spoke of the moment Fra Virosh died. Not because they didn't want to, because they couldn't. The air itself would not allow it. It was as though the temple had swallowed the memory the moment it occurred, the way the earth swallows blood, the way the silence swallows a scream. But some things cannot be buried. Some things remain. Pim didn't remember standing up. She only remembered the silence that followed his final breath. A silence so vast, so unnatural, it felt like the world itself stopped breathing. The chanting had ceased. No monk, no Tao, no echo rising from the cellar. A perfect, hollow stillness. For the first time in 30 years, the mountain was quiet. And that was far more terrifying. The prayer hall trembled, not violently, not like an earthquake, but like something beneath it stretched, like a muscle long bound suddenly released. The wooden floorboards groaned, the candles bent backward from an invisible wind. The mural on the wall blistered, paint bubbled and split, and then hands pressed from the inside, not painted hands, real, wet, flesh pressing against the surface of the mural as if the wall were soft skin. Tao collapsed to the floor, her head snapping back, her mouth wrenched open in a silent scream. Her eyes weren't hers anymore. They were black, reflective, empty. Pim rushed to her, shaking her shoulders. Tao, fight it! You have to... Tao's body snapped upright like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. Her voice, when it came, was layered, half hers, half something ancient. We don't want freedom. We want remembrance. The floor beneath them cracked. The mural split down the middle like a wound, exposing darkness deeper than space. And from that rift, they came. They did not pour out. They slid. Bodies thin as shadows, limbs too long, heads tilted at unnatural angles, as though still hanging from ropes. Their skin was gray. Their mouths were stitched shut with prayer beads. Their feet bled ash across the stone. They looked like monks once, before something hollowed them out and left them filled only with memory. The forsaken dead, the ones who had been bound, the ones the chant held down, now unchained. Pim stumbled backward, heart pounding so loudly it hurt. She grabbed the altar for balance and felt a hand grab hers. She spun. Fra Virosh, he stood upright beside her, but he wasn't breathing. His chest did not rise. His skin was blue at the lips, eyes sunken, dried blood trailing from his ears. A corpse, still standing. He turned his head, bones creaking like branches. It's not over. His voice came from deep in his chest, like something else was using him as a vessel. You must chain them again. How? Pim cried. With your grief. Something slammed against the outer door. Then again. The wood splintered. Outside, more voices whispered. Not words, just sounds, memories, regrets, lost prayers, broken lullabies. Each syllable carried weight. They were not attacking, they were remembering, and memory was enough to break the world apart. Pim staggered back. I don't know the chant. Fra Virosh's corpse turned to her, eyes empty, yet deeply sad. You don't read it, you feel it. He placed one cold hand over her heart. Speak what you mourn. She shook her head,
Tears welled in her eyes. I don't know how." "Then you will watch everything you've ever loved walk back to you, wearing someone else's face." The door snapped in half. A tide of shadows entered, slow, methodical, crawling over the floor and up the pillars like hungry vines. They didn't reach for Pim. They reached for the altar, for the prayer bowls, for the bones beneath, for the memory of the chant that used to bind them. Their mouths moved under the stitches, soundless. But inside Pim's mind, she heard them. "Remember us, remember us, remember us." They didn't want to kill her. They wanted something far worse. They wanted to be known. One of them stepped fully into the lantern light. Its face, half rotted, eyes pale but alert, stared directly at her. Recognition flickered there, familiarity, the shape of the cheekbones, the curve of the jaw. It looked like her father. Not exactly, but close enough to hurt. Tears broke from her eyes. "No, no, you're not." The figure tilted its head. "I remember you," it mouthed without sound. And yet, the shape was wrong. The voice in her mind was wrong. The movement of the lips was wrong. This was memory without identity, grief without shape. A soul that had forgotten how to be human, but remembered how to need. More emerged, surrounding her. Some wept, some convulsed, some crawled on their bellies like insects, leaving trails of black water in their wake. One reached toward the monk's body and smiled, not kindly, but with recognition. Fra Virash's corpse stepped protectively in front of Pim. "Chain them, now." His voice rattled like dry wood. Pim's breath trembled. Her knees buckled. She couldn't do it. She wasn't a monk. She wasn't holy. She wasn't... She closed her eyes and thought of all the things she had lost. Her mother's funeral, the student who died last summer, the childhood friend who never came home, the father who drank until he couldn't remember her name. All the grief she had swallowed became heat. She opened her mouth and sang. Not a melody, not words, just sound. Raw, torn, true, a chant born of sorrow older than language. The shadows shrieked, not from pain, but from recognition. They knew this sound. They remembered this sound. They had been waiting for it. The walls shook. The mural ignited in blue flame. Not fire that burned, but fire that revealed. Every face that had ever been forgotten appeared in the flames. Every loss, every silent death, every unburied memory. And Pim sang their names. Not perfectly, not even accurately, but with the weight of one who remembered what it meant to grieve. Chants are chains, and grief is the lock. The shadows fell to their knees, their bodies twisted, bones cracking, folding inward. Their stitched mouths opened, slowly, painfully, like roots tearing from stone. And together, they wept. The ash on the floor dissolved. The grave scent faded. The mural began to repair itself, stroke by stroke. Fra Virash's corpse crumpled to the floor, his head bowed. "It is done," he whispered. Pim collapsed in front of the altar, trembling, tears soaking the stone. She had done it. She had chained them again. And then the chant stopped. Completely. No voice, no echo, no memory. The silence that followed was not heavy. It was worse. It was empty. too empty, as if something had been erased. And in the distance, beyond the temple, beyond the forest, beyond the mountain, a bell rang. Not the temple bell, a different one, older, deeper, ringing from somewhere no living soul should hear. Something else heard her grief, something darker, something awake now.
The air was different now, not heavier, hollow. The chant was gone, and with it, something unspoken had been severed. Not just a ritual, not just a rhythm, but a tether, a connection between the living and the not quite dead, between memory and silence, between grief and the things that fed on it. Pim stood alone inside the prayer hall, her voice raw, her body trembling. The echo of her improvised chant still clung to the walls like smoke, but it faded quickly, too quickly. And the silence that rushed in afterward, that devoured everything she had spoken, was not natural. It was waiting. Fray Viroge's body had finally fallen still, not frozen in ritual posture, not sitting upright in prayer, just still, folded in death, skin grayed, lips parted. Pim reached for his hand. It was cold. She whispered, "I'm sorry," but the words felt meaningless, like offerings left at an altar that had already been abandoned by the gods. She closed his eyes with her fingertips. They did not stay shut. That evening, she dug a grave behind the temple, not because she believed it would help, but because it was all she had left to offer him, a man who gave his voice to keep the world quiet. She buried him beneath the Bodhi tree, without chanting, without prayer, only silence. And as she dropped the final handful of soil onto his chest, she whispered, "You kept them asleep. I'll remember that. I'll remember you." It wasn't a blessing. It was a promise. That night, Pim dreamt in blood. Not violence, not horror. Memory, but not her own. She stood barefoot in the temple decades earlier. Younger monks surrounded her. Children, really. Their faces were eager, innocent. One of them unrolled a scroll, yellowed, cracked, written in thick black ink. They laughed, they pointed, they chanted for fun. And then the light changed. The sound around them grew thick. Words stopped being words. Time bent in on itself. The scroll melted into ash. The murals began to paint themselves in real time. One by one, the monks collapsed, not from pain, but from knowing something too deeply. Only one remained upright, Fray Viroge. And in that dream, he looked directly at her. "I didn't want this. I only wanted to protect them." She awoke screaming. The next morning, the villagers came. Not many, only 4, but it was enough. They brought with them wooden bells, old symbols carved into their surfaces, protection charms. They placed them around the temple grounds without asking her permission. When Pim stepped out to meet them, one of the elders,
a woman in her 70s, skin like paper bark, simply said, "You broke it." Pim didn't argue. She only asked, "Do you know what's coming now?" The woman looked down the mountain path. "Only that it won't knock. It remembers the door." Back inside the temple, Pim found the altar cracked. A small hairline fracture that ran from its base to the center of the top. Barely noticeable, but it hadn't been there yesterday. Beneath it, the trapdoor still lay closed, but it pulsed. Not constantly, just once every few hours, like a slow heartbeat. She returned to the mural. It was fully healed. No more blood, no cracks, no eyes missing. But something was wrong. The figures in the mural were smiling now. And in the far corner, barely visible, a new face had been painted in. Hers. She collapsed onto the cold floor and wept. She didn't know why. It wasn't terror. It wasn't grief. It was failure. Something inside her knew the chant had only paused what was beneath, not sealed it, not ended it. The dead slept only when they were sung to, and now the song was unfinished, incomplete. She tried to chant again that night, tried to remember what she had sung from instinct, from emotion, from pain. But it didn't come. The grief was gone, or maybe just dulled, muted by exhaustion. She whispered syllables into the air, but they scattered like birds in the wind. There was no rhythm, no echo, no answer. It wasn't enough. She was not enough. That night, the well behind the temple whispered. She heard it through the open windows, not in words, but in a rhythm. A 3-beat knock, then a pause, then 3 more. Like a call, like someone asking to be let in. She lit a lantern and approached slowly. The forest bent toward her. Branches reached, leaves curled. At the edge of the well, she looked down and saw herself staring back at her. Not a reflection, a body, wet, still, floating in water that hadn't been there before. It opened its mouth, and in her voice it whispered, "You remembered too late." She ran, back to the temple, back to the altar. The trap door was open. She hadn't opened it. And from below came chanting. Faint, multiple voices. Not hers, not the monks. New ones. As if others had taken up the call. But the sound didn't rise. It sank. And for the first time, Pim realized, it's not a chant. It's a rope, and they're pulling it downward. She sat before the altar until sunrise, too afraid to sleep, too tired to think. And for the first time, she whispered, not a chant, not a name, not a prayer, just a plea. If anyone is listening, don't let me become the next one who chants alone. But the room remained still, and the only sound was her own voice echoing back to her, softly, mockingly, like a prayer cast into a well with no bottom.
The graves on the hill began to speak, not loudly, not with voices, but with names, whispered on the wind, breathed through the bamboo, heard in dreams and, more terribly, in moments of waking silence. Pim first noticed it 2 nights after the trapdoor opened on its own. She had walked into the forest edge to gather fresh water from the spring-fed pool where monks once bathed. And as she scooped water into her pot, the reflection on its surface spoke, not with lips, not with sound, but with her mother's voice, soft and trembling. "Don't leave me down here, child." The pot shattered in her hands. She fled barefoot and bleeding all the way back to the temple. But even as she ran, the trees called behind her, gentle, insistent, remembering. Pim, Pim, Pim. The next day, the villagers gathered in the schoolhouse at the base of the mountain, not for prayer, for protection. Charms were drawn, salt circles poured around spirit houses, incense burned from dawn until dusk. But the whispers came anyway. One woman claimed her dead husband had stood at the end of her bed the night before, not to haunt her, but to ask, "Is the boy still chanting?" When she asked what boy, he simply faded. Another man found his father's old robe laid across his porch, though the man had died in a monastery 2 decades ago and been cremated. The robe was damp. It smelled of wet ash. It had not rained in 4 days. By the end of the week, 5 villagers had taken sick, high fevers, sunken eyes. Each of them whispered in sleep. None of them used Thai. None of them used any language anyone recognized. But Pim knew what it was, the chant, twisting, winding its way into mouths that had never spoken it. She returned to the temple, her steps heavier now, not from exhaustion, but from knowledge. She now understood. The chant was never meant to contain the dead. It was meant to remember them, to hold space for them, to carry their names when the world forgot. And now the chant had broken, and the dead were desperate to be remembered by force. The hillside graves had always been humble, rows of stone markers, no grand tombs, no statues, just earth and names. But now the earth had begun to crack. Pim walked among the graves and saw the soil split at the corners. She saw old offerings unearthed, rotted fruits, faded photos, scraps of monk's cloth. And at one grave, freshly disturbed, she saw something else, a mouth. Just the mouth, half buried, still stitched shut, but moving. It whispered, "Not gone, just quiet." Back at the temple, Pim sealed the trapdoor. She recited the monk's name with every nail she drove into the boards. Praviroch, Praviroch, Praviroch. It wasn't enough, but it was all she had. The silence beneath the floor only pulsed stronger. That night the bell rang, once, twice, 3 times, but no one had pulled the rope. The rope itself had been cut days ago, and yet it sang. Pim stood in the main hall, trembling. The mural no longer showed monks. It showed villagers, crying, screaming, chanting,
each face twisted in silent agony. At the edge of the painting was her own face again, and this time her mouth was stitched shut. She turned away, lit a stick of incense, and opened the notebook. More pages had written themselves. The ink smelled like rust. The words were in that same ancient dialect, one she had learned not by study but by proximity, by feeling. It was the script of those bound to the chant, and it was not passive. It warned. They do not rise to harm, they rise to be heard. But when the living forget how to mourn, the dead must teach them how. Pim knew what she had to do. She climbed the mountain in the dark, barefoot like the novices once were, carrying only a single candle and her own fear. At the summit stood the old watch shrine, long abandoned. She knelt, lit the candle, closed her eyes, and remembered. Every name she could, every face she had lost, even those she barely knew, classmates, relatives, monks who once nodded to her in silence. She whispered them, one by one, into the dark, and the mountain listened. Wind rose behind her, slow and steady, like a breath finally released after holding too long. She felt the roots quiet. She felt the graves still. She felt something shift beneath the temple, not return to sleep, but sit, as if satisfied, as if heard. She didn't stop whispering until morning. When she returned to the temple, the trapdoor no longer pulsed. The mural had returned to a blank slate, and the bell rope had regrown, braided of red thread and black hair. Her own, she realized, as she reached to touch it. A gift, or a warning, perhaps both. Down in the village, the fevers broke. The sick woke up, but none of them remembered what they had said while sleeping. They only cried like they had just lost someone. When asked why, they said, "I feel like something let go of me." That night, Pim sat in the prayer hall alone. She did not chant, she just listened. And for the first time in days, there were no whispers, only breath, only night, only peace for now. But she left one thing at the edge of the altar, a piece of parchment. On it, written in faded ink, were the final words she had copied from the notebook, words that meant more now than ever. Grief is not a curse. It is the weight of remembering. And remembering is how we love the dead without inviting them home.
The temple no longer felt like stone and wood. It felt like skin, alive, tense, listening. Every step Pim took echoed through its bones, not with sound, but with response. The quiet had changed again. It wasn't the silence of peace, it was the silence of expectation, a waiting room for something ancient. She had done everything right. She had remembered the names, whispered grief into the darkness, laid Pra Virosh to rest, spoken the chant with her own sorrow, closed the mouths that once opened too wide. But now the temple demanded something else. Not words, not mourning, not memory. It wanted stillness. A stillness so complete, so pure, that it bordered on death.
It began with the birds. Gone. Not just quiet, but vanished. No feathers, no droppings, no nests, as if every wing had lifted in perfect unison and flown into a sky that never ended. Then came the insects, the geckos, the frogs that once hummed behind the prayer hall after rain. Gone. Then, the wind. The villagers noticed it too. Ajahn Surasak came up the mountain to see Pim in person. She met him at the edge of the temple gate. His eyes were ringed with red. His voice came low and unsteady. I dropped a cup. It hit the floor. No sound. He looked up at her, and for the first time she saw fear in him. Do you know what it means when the world stops responding to noise? She shook her head. It means something else is listening. That night, she walked barefoot to the shrine and stood before the altar. The candle wouldn't light, no matter how many matches she struck. She whispered to the flame, and still it refused. It wasn't wind. There was no wind. It was denial. The temple didn't want light. It wanted offering. But not of incense, not of food, not even of chanting. It wanted stillness. So Pim knelt, pressed her palms together, closed her eyes, and gave the temple her stillness. She didn't move for hours, didn't blink, didn't breathe too loudly. She let the silence pass through her, seep into her, dissolved the last flickers of resistance inside her spirit. And in return, the temple offered her a vision. It began in total blackness, then a sound, faint and trembling. A child sobbing. Pim turned toward it, not with her body, but with her mind. She walked through memories that weren't hers. She saw the 12 young monks gathered in the temple, their robes too large, their laughter reckless. She saw them find the scroll, cracked and inked in rust. She saw their curiosity turn into horror. And she saw how one by one they broke, not from what they did, but from what they stopped hearing. They chanted, and the forest stopped responding. The wind died. The stars above the temple dimmed. Not a single dog barked in the village below for 7 nights. They had offered their sound to the spirits, and the spirits had taken everything else, except the monk who stayed. Pra Virosh, the one who refused to speak until every other voice had gone. He chanted not to bind, but to fill the void they had created. He didn't trap the dead, he replaced them. Pim woke hours later, back in the prayer hall. Her limbs ached, her throat burned. She hadn't spoken, but something had still been taken from her. She walked to the altar and saw it. A new offering bowl, one she hadn't placed there. Inside, her voice. Not metaphorically, literally. A small clay bowl sealed with wax and string, and inside, swirling like smoke beneath the lid, a trace of her own breath. She opened her mouth to speak, and no sound came out. She tried to scream. Nothing. The temple had taken her voice. In the village, the silence spread. Children cried without sound. Chickens flapped without clucking. Doors slammed and left no echo. People began to panic, and yet no one screamed, because they couldn't. Ajahn Surasak returned to Pim one last time. He carried a bell, an old one, copper, hand-carved, its handle in the shape of a monk bowing. He offered it to her without speaking. She took it, rang it. It made no sound. He bowed once and left. The temple's silence had grown stronger than any object, stronger than metal, stronger than wind. Only one thing could break it. Not sound, not voice, but pain. That night, Pim knelt once more, before the altar, before the mural, before the quiet, and she gave the only offering left, her suffering. She took the edge of a broken ceramic ball, pressed it to her palm, sliced across. Blood spilled, dripped onto the stone, soaked into the cracks between prayer tiles. She whispered through her lips, though no voice came, "I give you what I carry, what he carried, what we all carry. Let it be enough." And the silence trembled, not broke, but rippled like wind across still water. The flame returned, one small flicker, a single candle, lit without spark. And in the glow, Pim saw the mural had shifted again. 12 monks, smiling. Behind them, a 13th, cloaked in shadow, unpainted, unformed. Her, waiting. The next morning, Pim woke with her voice returned. But when she spoke, it was not alone. A second voice lingered behind hers. Not echo, not spirit, memory. The temple had taken part of her and left her part of it in return. In the days that followed, the silence lifted from the village. Birdsong returned. Laughter echoed again. The bell in the school rang with bright joy. But the temple never laughed. It listened. It always listened. And it always would. Because now it had an offering bowl that could never be emptied. Her.
Some choices are made once. Others are made again and again in silence, in grief, in the space between breath and word. Pim didn't realize she had chosen until there was no one left to walk down the mountain with. The village slowly healed. The fevered children woke. The sound returned to doors, to rivers, to laughter. Even the crows began to scream again from the treetops, their cries harsh and beautiful in their crudeness. But the temple stayed silent, not empty, just watching. She walked through its halls like a ghost now, barefoot, no longer needing to whisper apologies to the shadows. They knew her now. She belonged to them. Or perhaps they belonged to her. The altar had changed. A new name had been carved into the base overnight. Pim. No one had carved it. And yet there it was, etched in shallow grooves, as if it had always waited to be written. She reached out to trace the letters, but stopped. Something told her, if you touch it, you stay. She left the temple grounds that morning, not to escape,
to say goodbye. She walked down the mountain path barefoot, the same path the crew had climbed months earlier. So much had changed. No film crew now. No gear. No questions. Just her, and the gravity of what had been awakened. At the village, Ajahn Surasak met her with quiet eyes. No one else approached. They all sensed it. She had gone too far into the silence. She had breathed the chant, and now the chant breathed her. He poured her tea and set it between them without words. Only after a long while did he speak. "It will need a voice again, one day." She nodded. "Soon. You will be alone." She gave a tired smile. He was too. That night she dreamed of the boy again, Bunmi. But now he was older, wiser, tired in a way no child should be. He sat beside her on the steps of the temple, gazing at the stars that still refused to shine above it. "You know what it takes now," he said. She nodded. "I thought I'd be afraid," she whispered. "You were, but you stayed. Am I the new monk?" He looked at her with eyes full of sorrow and strange hope. "No. You are the memory. The voice is just the shape it wears." She woke with salt on her lips and clay dust on her fingers. In the candlelight, a new robe had been folded beside her mat. Not golden, not saffron, gray. And the prayer beads looped beside it were made of bone. The bell rang once that morning, not by her hand, but in recognition, acceptance. It was time. She climbed back to the altar, sat where Praviraj had once knelt, crossed her legs, folded her hands, closed her eyes, and waited. For the words, for the rhythm, for the grief to rise. Nothing came. Only breath. But that was enough, because breath is where the chant begins. Not with sorrow, with surrender. She stayed like that for hours, listening to the temple, to the floor, to the roots, to the walls, to the stone bones of the mountain. And then she heard it, the first syllable, faint, not from outside, from within. It wasn't the chant she had heard before, not the monks, not the novices, not the dead. It was hers, a new rhythm, a new voice, built from the weight she carried and the names she would never forget. It came slowly, soft, measured, unfolding like dusk. She let it come. The first night was the hardest. Her throat ached, her tongue bled from dryness. She shook from cold and fear. But she did not stop. And in return, the silence sat beside her like an old friend who finally stopped asking for more. The villagers heard the chant again, faint at first, then clear, and they knew. Someone had stayed. Someone was speaking for them, for the dead, for the broken names, for the memories that would one day try to crawl back. They didn't climb the hill. They didn't need to. Not anymore. Weeks passed. Seasons shifted. And still she chanted. Not every hour, but often enough that the soil didn't crack. that the mural stayed still, that the graves didn't whisper in sleep. She learned to speak with the mountain, not with words, with rhythm, with pause, with silence offered like prayer. One night she heard footsteps outside the hall, slow, deliberate, perhaps a child. She opened her eyes and saw a figure in novice robes standing beneath the bell tower. A boy, barefoot. He bowed, and in the language of those who still remember grief, he whispered, "I heard it. Can I learn?" She nodded, smiled, gestured him in. He sat beside her, and the chant began again. Two voices now, still soft, still slow, but not alone, not anymore.
The footage was found by accident. A pair of hikers, two brothers from Chiang Mai, had taken a wrong trail during the rainy season and ended up near the southern slope of the mountain. Thick brush, unmarked stone, something that didn't appear on maps. They had been walking for 6 hours when they came across it. A rusted camera bag, torn at the strap, laced with vines, half buried beneath a tree that had grown sideways, as if leaning away from something unseen. Inside the bag, one water-damaged hard drive wrapped in cloth, 2 batteries, a cracked lens, a camera body with mud inside it, and an SD card, still intact. They didn't know what they had found. Not until weeks later, when they returned home and passed the bag off to a cousin who worked at a digital recovery shop. The footage was corrupted, but not completely. The sound remained. The frames partially restored. It was dated nearly 6 months earlier, and it was labeled Wat Kiriluang Raw B. The first clip was nothing unusual. Trees, footsteps, laughter. A tracking shot of the temple steps. Then the camera cuts, a classic jump, and reopens on the face of Pim. She looks older than in the other recovered stills. Tired, changed. The angle is low, as if the camera had been placed deliberately on a stone wall or altar. Pim sits in the center of the frame, cross-legged before the main shrine. She isn't speaking, but her lips move. She is chanting, softly, almost soundlessly. But the camera's mic, cheap and unfiltered, picks it up. The chant isn't recognizable. It doesn't match the monks, doesn't match any known script, but it holds weight. Each syllable lands like a drop of water in a deep cavern, soft but endless in its echo. The clip runs for 15 minutes. Then it cuts to black. Silence. Then a second clip auto-loads. This one is darker, unstable. The image shakes as if the camera were handheld in a storm. Pim is gone. The temple is empty. The main doors hang open. The wind moves, but only inside, and in the far distance, someone is humming. Not a melody, not a song, just the low rhythmic pulse of the chant. At minute 6, the camera glitches, just briefly, a flicker, and for 3 frames, something moves across the doorway. Too fast, too pale. Review slowed the footage down to 1/120th speed, frame by frame. A figure, white-robed, bent at the spine, dragging prayer beads that scraped across the stone. No face,
just smooth skin where features should be, but hands, long, jointed, pressed together in prayer. In the last frame before the figure disappears, its mouth opens, and inside, another mouth. Then the camera freezes. The final frame holds for 13 minutes, but the timestamp continues to count. 13 minutes of absolute stillness. No sound, no wind, no dust moving across the lens. Just the altar, empty, unlit. And in the center of the screen, a faint shape begins to form. Not on the altar, in the lens. A reflection of someone behind the camera. But no one was holding it. When the hiker's cousin played the clip back in his studio, the reflection unnerved him so deeply he contacted a local historian. The historian brought it to a folklore professor at Chiang Mai University, and she recognized the place immediately. "This is the mountain with the silent bell," she said. "My grandmother used to tell stories of it." "What kind of stories?" "That it holds voices that were never meant to stop." The footage was never made public. It was passed around among researchers, anthropologists, spiritualists. None could explain the final clip, especially not the final 10 seconds, because in those seconds, the reflection blinks once, and the reflection's mouth begins to move. Not randomly, not muttering, chanting, perfectly, even though the audio is silent. A sound engineer tried to overlay the chant from earlier in the video. When they matched it, frame by frame, the reflection's lips synced exactly. And at the final second, the reflection smiles. Not human, not cruel, just knowing, as if it has been waiting. After that, the video ends. No exit screen, no glitch, just black. 2 weeks later, one of the hikers stopped speaking. He didn't lose his voice, he just chose not to use it. Doctors couldn't find anything wrong, but every night his family claimed they could hear him humming in his sleep. Low, repetitive, rhythmic. When they recorded the sound and played it back through waveform analysis, the pattern formed a loop, not just of sound, but of names, over and over, as if he was remembering something that had never been his to remember. Down in the village, a new rumor began. The monk was dead, but someone else had taken his place. Not a monk, not a man, not even a believer. Just someone who heard the chant and chose to stay. No one climbed the mountain to confirm it. They didn't need to, because on quiet nights, when the wind shifted just right, they could hear it again, soft, measured, a single voice, and underneath it, something else chanting with her in perfect unison.
Time forgets places like Wat Kitty Luong. They slip from the maps. They fade from memory. They become rumors, cautionary tales told in soft tones by candlelight. But not all places stay silent just because no one speaks of them. And not all prayers are offered by choice. The villagers no longer speak of the temple by name, only in gesture, only in breath. They nod toward the mountain. They cross themselves in the old ways, even if they no longer believe. And when the night winds pass over the rice fields, they listen, because on certain nights they still hear it. The chant, not loud, not pleading, just present. They say a woman lives there now, a young one once, now older but not old. Her voice never hoarse, her breath never short. She does not eat when others do. She does not leave when the rain floods the lower paths. She stays. She remembers. Because remembering is the only way to keep the dead at rest. Children are told not to climb the mountain, not because it's dangerous, but because it asks too much. The old saying goes, "Those who hear the chant may carry it. Those who carry it must never let it go." One boy once tried. 6 years old, curious, bold, he wandered past the lower shrine, climbed the old steps with a rock in one hand and a bag of sweets in the other. He reached the edge of the temple just after dusk and stopped. Not because he was afraid, but because someone was sitting at the bell tower waiting. A woman in gray, eyes calm, mouth closed. But he could hear it, inside her, the chant. Not loud, not even spoken. It just was. She smiled at him, didn't scold, didn't shout. She simply raised one finger to her lips, and he understood, not in words, but in weight, that some sounds are sacred and some silences are made of sacrifice. He turned, walked back down. He never told anyone what he'd seen, but he never sang again, not even to himself. Years passed, seasons shifted, storms came and went. The forest grew thick around the temple walls. The bamboo returned to twist its fingers around the old gate. But the bell never rusted, because sometimes it rang, always on its own, always at dusk, and never more than 12 times. Scholars came once. They climbed, asking questions, eager to record, to understand, to publish. They left after one night. They didn't speak of what they found. Only one of them left behind a single sentence carved into a wooden slat nailed to a tree halfway up the trail. She does not chant alone. And that is the truth. Pim chants still, in voice, in breath, in silence. And when she sleeps, which is rare, the temple chants for her. The stone, the trees, the walls, they carry the sound, soft as dust falling through light. And beneath the floorboards, something responds, not with threat, not with hunger, with acknowledgement, because it has been remembered. And in that remembering, it does not need to rise. The mural on the temple wall never fades now. It changes, each year a new face, not monks, not saints, just people, some from the village, some from nowhere known, all remembered, all gently chanting. And in the center, always her, not larger, not brighter, just present. Eyes closed, palms together, mouth open mid-chant, and painted behind her a second mouth, one she never turns to face,
because to face it is to hear it directly, and that is not for the living. Some say she is no longer alive, that she gave up her body years ago and became part of the mountain. Others say she walks still barefoot, still whispering names into the cracks between tree roots and gravestones. But no one dares check, because peace is fragile, and silence is a door that opens both ways. So they leave her be. They bow when they pass. They light incense from a distance. And they never ask if she's still chanting, because they know the answer. She is. She always will. Because those who chant alone never truly are.